So, John White here with Stories from the Revolution. And again, I get to hang out with my good friend Kent Smith. We are doing, I think, 3 episodes on discipleship movements or disciple making movements, and particularly on Luke 10's unique approach to that. Episode number 75 we did a couple of weeks ago, and now 77, and I expect we'll do probably one more on that. So again, the context of this particular topic grew out of a fellow named Robbie Butler contacting Kent and myself back in 2014, almost 9 years ago. And he was doing a project on for Frontier Missions magazine on what was called 4x4 discipleship movements. So the idea is 4 lineages, 4 family lines going at least 4 generations deep. And that was sort of their measurement on how you might measure a discipleship or disciple making movement. And they were having various ministries, DMM, disciple making movements, T4T were 2 of the ones that were commenting on this or being reported on. And Kent and I each wrote our own emails to Robbie. We included them together, and we became aware that we have a pretty different perspective on this whole idea from what some of these other ministries have been doing. So again, last time was my opportunity. So this time, my friend Kent. So Kent, why don't you take it away?
Sure. So I'm just going to read back pretty much what I wrote at that time, and then, as you said, John, we'll just visit back and forth a little bit about this as we go. So here's what I wrote. Dear Robbie and John, thanks for including me in this conversation. I really appreciate the humility on display as fellow learners in what God is doing in our time. Robbie, I'm delighted to make your acquaintance, and as a longtime teacher of missions, appreciate the great contribution to the kingdom that Missions Frontier has made over the years. What follows here are a few thoughts that express both my affirmation and my reservation about 4x4 and similar movements. What's evident from your examples and many others through history is that when God is at work in a particular place and time, we sometimes see movements where multiplication is happening fairly quickly across generations and through multiple relational networks. This is to be celebrated. While this is the case, it's also axiomatic that what gets measured gets attention. If we accept this as true, we will want to be very thoughtful about what we go about measuring, to be sure that it is, in fact, what most deserves our attention. You want to say anything about that thought, John?
I certainly agree with that. I think we both would agree that there's nothing innately wrong with measuring numbers or 4 generations or 4 lines or whatever else, but it can easily become the focus, and we can lose touch with what maybe is more important, which I think is what you're about to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so going on with what I wrote, here is where some of my major questions come in for approaches like 4x4. I don't think anyone committed to the kingdom should object to healthy discipleship that is flowing rapidly through 4 or more generations across 4 or more family lines. This is good news wherever it may be happening. The potential problem lies in what we are measuring, what has our attention. And I would suggest that as soon as we begin to think in effect that the health of a movement can be assessed by rapid growth along 4 lines and 4 generations, we are in danger of measuring the wrong thing. Now, I understand that those who advocate for this would be the first to add, of course, we assume and understand that healthy discipleship lines are the ones that we would count. To be sure, rapid growth that produces syncretists or materialists or jaded, disillusioned believers, for example, may be a net loss for God's kingdom. It would seem the case that healthy discipleship is precisely what cannot be assumed. Why, for example, do we not have the 9F movement? for evident fruits of the Spirit, or the 2G movement for people manifestly embodying the two greatest commandments? Are we really measuring for what matters most? Any thoughts at that point, John?
Well, when you said rapid growth, I think that's right. We can't assume that it is necessarily a good thing. Sometimes it is. But I was thinking in the physical world, cancer has the capacity to grow rapidly. It's not healthy and it'll kill you, but it is rapid. And so rapid growth by itself is certainly not enough.
Yeah, and I think any thoughtful Christian who has a little bit of awareness of church history over the last couple thousand years can probably call to mind some examples of just that kind of growth that ultimately we would probably call cancerous. Maybe it looked great on the front end, but ultimately it led to movements that were tremendously destructive and harmful to not only the people that experienced it, but the whole reputation of what Christianity and the church is all about. So we certainly don't want to just assume that because we're seeing rapid growth somewhere, lots of people are jumping on board really quickly, that's evidence of God's favor, for sure.
Some other examples come to mind, and that would be like with some mega churches. There are some mega churches that are very healthy, but we're hearing almost every week stories of senior pastors who are engaged in some sort of abuse. The Mars Hill story with Mark Driscoll is one of those. That was a rapidly growing church. I mean, people were coming from all over to see what was going on. Willow Creek with Bill Hybels was teaching people all over the place how to create a growing church. Well, it turns out there was some real unhealth at the core of what Bill was doing and what Mark was doing. So other examples of exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think thoughtful people who were in those movements and maybe were even contributing to leadership in those movements have often now taken a pause and realized, wow, this looked so amazing at the time. It looked so clearly effective and powerful at the time. And yet, as we kind of drill into the long-term fruit, are disciples of Jesus really being made? Are the fruits of the Spirit really being manifested? Is joy and peace and hope and under it all, over it all, love ultimately evident in these movements? And I think thoughtful practitioners, careful historians would say, in many, many cases, no, that was not what was being produced in the middle of all of that fury and fame and glory. That was not what was happening.
And so sadly, rapid growth was almost a defense of bad behavior. So maybe the pastor there were a lot of stories about him bullying the other staff or members of the church, but it was justified. Look at how this church is growing. I mean, Sunday morning attendance is just doubled and it's really going great. Well, that misses the whole idea of what we're talking about here.
So as a missionary trainer for over 30 years, this is one of the more heartbreaking things. Let me kind of carry on with what I wrote to Robbie. So one place this all becomes abundantly clear is in the lives of committed kingdom workers. Having studied spiritual nurture over 4 decades and training missionaries full-time for nearly 30 years, I have seen my share of mission movements, healthy and not so healthy. What I know firsthand is that measurements of missionaries and their work that weigh criteria other than attending to and following Jesus steadily and faithfully lead to broken movements and broken missionaries. When young leaders are pressed to produce along criteria other than faithfulness to the Lord, their attention is misdirected with results that are often devastating for them and for their work. To be sure, we can plant and water as the Lord leads, but it is still God who gives the increase. And just an additional thought there. For me, it has been particularly grievous to see young missionaries find an agency or a supporting church or churches who agree to send them to do work in the mission field whether in North America or elsewhere in the world, who then are given a set of criteria by which their work will be measured. And again, all measurements not bad, but we just have to be aware that the measurements we use will profoundly shape what we give our attention to. And if those measurements are not ultimately leading the worker back to listening to the Lord and doing what the Lord is leading them into, if it's some kind of externally imposed criteria, how many baptisms are you getting? How many churches are you planting? How many new leaders have you recruited? Et cetera, et cetera. Those workers will inevitably pour their lives into what can I do? What must I do in order to continue the work here, to keep the support coming, to keep the favor of those who have sent me? And in so many cases, that is the exact opposite of what they need to be doing if they were attending to the Lord and to the real people and the real context in which they're living and working.
Yep.
Anything you'd want to add there?
Yeah, I thought I'm thinking of a fellow that I talked to some years ago who worked with a campus ministry, and their requirement was that he would share his faith with at least 10 people a week, and he had to report on that. And, it was such an artificial kind of thing. It wasn't spirit-led at all. And it creates tremendous stress in the heart of the individual who's trying to live up to that. But that was his success, and his continued support was based upon whether he could fulfill that criteria or not.
So here's a story from my own heritage that I mentioned to Robbie in this letter. My own spiritual lineage traces back in part to an elderly woman in the early 20th century who took notice of a small, dirty girl named Mabel in her Memphis neighborhood. This woman befriended Mabel, introducing her to the Lord and to the Lord's people over several years. Then Mabel's family moved away, and as far as we know, she never had contact again with her Memphis friend. When Mabel grew up and found her life falling apart, though, she remembered those years and decided to follow Jesus. Over her lifetime, she and her husband planted over 12 churches, raised 12 children who became powerful witnesses of Jesus. Today, we can trace tens of thousands of believers, powerful ministries, and kingdom leaders to the influence of little Mabel. My point is this: the elderly sister in Memphis could have decided to spend her time on the basis of who or what in my life has the potential to produce a rapid 4T movement. In that case, though, I doubt she would have invited Mabel in for cookies. Anything about that story that is striking to you, John?
It's a beautiful story. I think we could probably all think of unimpressive people that don't meet the qualification, and yet God uses them in amazing ways. So, no, that's great.
Yeah, my dad's got a famous speech in which he tells that story, and that he titles it "Maybe There's a Mabel," because
I love it.
So often God's work comes in just that sort of unexpected yeast-like way. I mean, it's really at the heart of the Luke 10:2b prayer, right? The Lord of the harvest is the one who selects those people, right, who are going to be the beachheads for the coming of the kingdom. And if we simply use arbitrary criteria for deciding how we're going to spend our time, a lot of times we'll blow right past the Mabels that God puts in our pathway. So critical to think very carefully about what are we measuring.
Yes.
Well, so here's how I wrap up the letter. Well, what I had started as a brief comment seems to keep growing. To conclude, it seems to me we are on more solid ground to focus on what we know has God's attention, namely a bride comprised of people from all the families of humanity. This is why we are focused on doing our part to see a vibrant family of Jesus in close reach, culturally and geographically, of everyone. As John said in his previous note, we're still in the middle of learning what this takes, but what we are measuring, beginning with a vibrant family of Jesus, seems to me a helpful picture of what has God's attention and should therefore have ours.
Hmm.
And then I close with appreciation again for the spirit in which Robbie was engaging us in this. It's clear to me that we're on the same team.
Amen. Several just other comments that I wrote down here relate to this. First of all, I would say that Luke 10, we measure, we keep track of people that are going through Church 101 and things like that. So it's not like we think measurement is wrong. It's when it becomes the primary focus of the preoccupation of what we're doing. The next thought I had was I thought of Peter. Is it Matthew 16? So they're right in the middle of this great movement, and people are showing up. Thousands of people are following Jesus. Things are looking really good, and Jesus says to Peter, "Oh, by the way, I'm going to go to Jerusalem and be killed." And Peter says, "Surely not, Lord. Are you serious? This thing's actually starting to work." But God's plan wasn't to do it that way, just to see the steady increase of numbers like that. And we can miss what it is that God's up to if we're too preoccupied on that. Mm-hmm. So that's a thought. I have another one, but any comment you want to make on that?
Yeah, no, I concur. I think it's so easy for us to measure things in what seems like good, sensible human measurements, and ultimately miss the thing that God is up to. That seems to be what we're almost assured if we take seriously the Jesus point that apart from me you can do diddly squat, to get to the Greek translation there very carefully. If we really hear that seriously, if we hear Jesus saying you can do absolutely nothing apart from me, then it ought to cause us to take all of our measurements, our humanly inspired ways of determining our success, very lightly, and to deepen our capacity for paying deep attention to God again today, in this situation, in this context, with the community that God's given me, so that we're collectively discerning the thing that God is actually doing, not just what we think God should be doing or we wish God was doing.
Two final thoughts for me. One is I've been doing a number of episodes on the He Gets Us campaign, and in all the things that you read online, they have some incredible numbers. We've had 500,000 engagements, whatever an engagement is, and I was thinking about maybe they have to do that because the thing that Jesus told us to do was to make disciples. And knowing how to quantify when a person is a disciple, when they're not, how do you count disciples? It's not easy to do. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to wrestle with that. That's one issue. And lastly, I was thinking back when I was in my last year of seminary, Fuller Seminary, 1973. There was a guy named Dr. Donald McGavran. Some of you old timers here listening to this will know that name. It was sort of the father of the church growth movement. And for a long time, Dr. McGavran was convinced that this technology should only be applied overseas. The American church doesn't really need this. But some people prevailed upon him, and he agreed to teach a class on church growth thinking principles at Lake Avenue Congregational Church, a large church there in Pasadena. I was sort of seminary intern, and so that was the staff of the church, and Dr. McGavran, Peter Wagner, Chuck Kraft, all those guys in the School of World Missions. And as a lowly seminary intern, I get to sit in the class, which is pretty exciting. This is like cutting edge stuff. That was 50 years ago. As I think back, church growth thinking became really a big thing. And it was driving, how do we build mega churches and how do we church planting movements and all those things. But, I don't think the church in America is healthier today than it was then. In fact, I think it's really gone downhill. And I wonder if the obsession sometimes with numerical growth Again, not opposed to measuring, but the obsession with numerical growth at any cost has really cost us a lot of things that we didn't, unexpected consequences, I guess, of all of that. So 50 years.
Yeah, boy, so true. And as you said at the beginning of your remarks there, a big part of the challenge is that it's hard for us to measure the things that it seems like God really cares about. How do you measure how much a person has grown in love over the last 3 weeks? How can you give attention to how much a community has grown in intimacy or in truthfulness over the last year? What are the criteria you use to get at those kinds of measurements? That's just frustrating. It's a little bit like, asking how do you determine the health of an ecosystem? Well, there are ways to do it, but you have to pay attention in a lot of directions at once to have a sense for how does this whole complex biological, organic, and how does this all work? And I think it would be almost feel like an exercise in futility if it weren't for the fact that the one who has called us to do this is actually aware of all of those variables. And so we can become effective catalysts for kingdom growth. But the Lord is going to have to be the one who directs our attention at each point along the way in what is the next step. We simply cannot calculate or franchise our way into healthy church growth, healthy church movements. You can't do it. It's not humanly possible. It's only divinely possible. And that means we have to become radical attention payers. I guess
what God's doing, right? That's the key.
That's right. That's it. We've got to become attentive to what God's up to. Yeah. I guess I would say, by way of encouragement to those who are listening and wondering, well, what in the world am I supposed to do with all this? It is exciting that we've got a book coming out. I'll come back to that in a second. I wrote a couple of articles in the Missio Dei Journal along the lines of what we're talking about here in issue 4.1 and 7, I think. And for those of you who are Bible geeks and would like to get into some of the nuts and bolts of the biblical and theological underpinnings of some of what we're saying here, I'd refer you to those articles. But our new book, Relational Revolution, is going to, at least at the sort of 50,000 foot level, give an overview of how I think we can realistically measure and invest in healthy replication and kingdom growth along the lines of what we've been talking about here.
Yep. Coming out in, what's it looking like now?
Early April, I think, is probably the realistic date.
We'll be saying more about that, obviously, on this podcast. So maybe closing comment would be, I think Kent and I agree. We agree on almost everything. Well, not really. We argued a few times. But we just have had such fun traveling together over these last 15 plus years. But I think we both agree that we appreciate every group, every ministry, every church that is seeking to make disciples. We think there's a place for healthy conversations about what that looks like and how we do that. But everyone that has a heart to obey what Jesus called us to do, to make disciples, we have a high regard for every group that's doing that. So, well, Ken, thank you. This is we'll finish this up here, and hopefully this will be of help to people.